Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Academy Zoom event entitled The Fight for Congress, the 2022 midterm elections, and what they portend for America's democracy. And our guest today is Doug Sosnick. Doug Sosnick has a long history in Washington as a political advisor and analyst. He advises numerous politicians, corporations, foundations, universities, and the like. He is best known as having been a senior advisor and White House political director for Bill Clinton. He spent 6 years in the Clinton White House and was a central player in that very successful operation. Doug is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Applebee's America: How Successful Political, Business, and Religious Leaders Connect with the New American Community. And he is also a senior advisor at the Brunswick Consultancy. Doug, it has been an up and down electoral season. We were first sure it was going to be a wave election for Republicans, as so many midterms are. Then suddenly it was Democrats who appeared to be on top during much of the summer. Now Democrats are having a case of high anxiety. Can you make sense of this, particularly at a time when everyone seems to believe that the stakes are very high? I just want to tell our viewers that Doug and I will be talking. Doug will make his presentation. Doug and I will talk a little. Please, when you want to put questions in, put them in the Q&A format, not in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. Doug, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here. I'm going to, it has been an up and down cycle. You're right about that. I'm going to try to cover briefly 3 topics before we get to our discussion. One is I'm going to try to put some context to what's going on in American politics, what I often call trying to explain the unexplainable. Because I don't think you can understand what's going to happen in the midterms without understanding the context of what's going on in our country. So I want to give a little context to our politics. I do want to talk about the midterms, but I think most importantly is going to be what's going to happen the day after the midterms and what's the country going to look like after that. In many ways, the midterms, I think, is probably the least important of the 3 to understand American politics. In context, we're going through, I think in the world, but I'll leave it in America right now, we're going through the biggest change in America since the late 1800s, when we moved from an agrarian society to an industrial society. We've been moving now for about 50 years from a 20th century top-down manufacturing society to a 21st century digital global economy, and our current 20th century institutions are incapable of dealing with these 21st century problems. So most people in America now think that institutions in our country are either broken or they're corrupt, and that's driving our politics. So as a result, in 7 out of the last 8 elections, the country's voted against whoever is in power, regardless of political party. So 7 out of the last 8 elections, the country's gone out and voted against whoever they supported 2 years earlier. So this is a period during this transition of anger and alienation towards our institutions. If the Democrats lose the House and the Senate in 2 weeks, that Joe Biden will be the 5th president in a row. He'll be the 5th president in a row to have lost the House and Senate while president. So, as I tell people, if you want to understand American politics, you can't focus on the 2022 midterm tree. You need to take a step back and look at the political forest, because this is just a stop along the way of something much more profound than just an election where people are voting. And I do want to make one admonition about how much you can interpret the meaning of a midterm election in terms of what's going to happen in the future. Midterm elections are all about turnout. They're completely different than presidential elections. And if you take since World War II, the 2 biggest landslide midterm elections for the out party was in 1994 and 2010, when Republicans made historic gains over the Democrats. Both in 1994 and 2020, despite those gains, 2 years later, the Republicans lost the White House in both of those cases. And in many cases, in fact, what it takes to be successful in a midterm, which is motivating your base and appealing to a narrow segment of voters, is exactly what you shouldn't do if you're trying to win in a presidential election year when more people are voting. And in fact, in the most recent NBC poll that came out over the weekend, while there's a general expectation that Republicans are going to do well in November, they're in fact lagging behind the Democrats in their ratings in the polls. People actually think less of Republicans, but it's these larger societal forces that's driving our politics, which is much more impactful right now than your view of the political parties and an off-year election where turnout is everything. And my one prediction I feel confident is that we'll have our election on a Tuesday. By the Sunday, when the Sunday shows and all the people get on and talk about things, they will have already moved on to the next election and will not be talking about the midterm election anymore. So the midterm election is relevant. I don't want to diminish its importance. It is not the most important election in our lifetime. 2024, well, could be that. But I think it's important to put in context what we're going to learn and what we're not going to learn from the 2024 midterms. Now, in regards to the 2022 midterms, Daniel's right. There have been really three phases to this. There's the phase that went until about March of this year, which is Republicans are going to win. They always win in the off years, big expectations, red tsunami. And then that really began to change with the leak and then the final release of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. And so for around 100 days, up until around Labor Day, there was a broad expectation that the election, actually, the Democrats could do well. Things are even, the enthusiasm levels are even. But since, I would say, right after Labor Day, the momentum has clearly shifted towards the Republicans. I think it's largely due to a downturn in the economy, continuing rise of inflation, and just an overall feeling that things aren't going well in this country. Over 70% of the people in this country feel like we're headed in the wrong direction. We have over 8% inflation, the highest since the early 1980s. The consumer confidence is near the lowest level since they started measuring it in the 1950s. Joe Biden's job approval is in the low to mid 40s. Those are all recipes by historical standards for a terrible election for the party in power. And increasingly, that looks the direction of the election. So in the Senate, it's a 50-50 Senate right now. They're really, at this point, only considered, if it's a relatively close election, 3 states that are considered competitive, considered toss-ups. Pennsylvania held by the Republicans, and Georgia and Nevada held by the Democrats. There was a debate last night in Pennsylvania between 2 people who really have no business running for the United States Senate. Oz in Pennsylvania, who's kind of a media personality candidate, and Fetterman, the Democrat who suffered a severe stroke 5 months ago. It was a debate that did not go well for Fetterman, who clearly has not recovered from his stroke. So I assume the Republicans will feel more optimistic today than yesterday about holding on to the Pennsylvania seat. They're currently ahead in Nevada. In Georgia is considered a toss-up. So when you come out of all this, if it's a relatively close election, it looks like Republicans could win 2 seats and have a 52-48 advantage. If it becomes what we call a tsunami election with a real true red wave, then I think Republicans could pick up a 3rd seat in Georgia and potentially even seats in New Hampshire and Colorado. So they could get up to 54 or 55. But I think they're favored to at least narrowly take control of it. I should mention to you that in 2024, there's not a single Republican seat that's going to be vulnerable. There are 8 Democratic seats up, 3 of which are in bright red Republican states and 5 are in toss-up states. So if the Republicans were to take the Senate back this year, I think they're going to hold the Senate well into the decade. And it's going to be very difficult. I can explain it if you're interested about why the voting patterns are such. But I think the Republicans are poised to have a long-term grip on the United States Senate. If they, for some reason, don't take it back this November, they will almost certainly take it back in 2024. In the House, there's a 5-seat majority by the Democrats right now, which is very narrow, the narrowest in 20 years. Charlie Cook, which is an independent political prognosticator, he currently has the Republicans favored to pick up 9 seats, a net of 9 seats that are held by Democrats. So if that's almost twice what they need. In addition to that, there are 33 toss-up seats, 23 of which are held by Democrats. So the math is very bad for Democrats right now, where they're right now favored to lose 4 seats more than their majority, and that still leaves 33 toss-ups, vast majority of which are held by Democrats. And right now, if you look at the Republicans, they are spending money in the last 2 weeks of the campaign in congressional districts that Joe Biden carried by 12 points or more in 2020. So they're on the Democratic side of the field right now, smelling blood in a year that all the factors would suggest that they're going to have a big victory. The turnout is everything in a midterm, as I mentioned. The highest turnout in 100 years was in 2018. It looks like the turnout based on early voting right now will be higher than 2018. Over 10 million people have already voted. Probably half the people were going to vote before Election Day. So the turnout that I'm going to be most interested in looking is the partisanship, whether Democrats, Republicans are turning out more. And the other is young voters. Young voters, I would say they support Democrats. They actually don't like Democrats, but they loathe Republicans. And they were a central part of Biden's victory in 2020. Young people historically tend to not vote in off-year elections. So for Democrats to cut their losses this year, it's going to be essential that young people vote. And so I'm going to be very interested to see how high the turnout is of young people. There are 3 groups in particular that I would pay attention to see how they vote. One are suburban voters, the second are Hispanic voters, and the third are independent voters. So in America, we have really increasingly self-selected where we live and who we choose to live around. And it's based on shared values. And as a result, and that's one of the reasons why we have so few competitive Senate seats and House seats any longer, because by the self-selection of where people live, it's increasingly becoming one-party rule based on the values of the people that live there. So in America now, the urban areas are basically the base for Democrats, and the rural areas are the base for Republicans. So suburban America, which is around 55% of the country, that's where the only competitive races are in America. And that's where close statewide elections are decided. So the suburbs is going to be critical to see how the voting is there. The second group are Hispanics. As recently as 4 years ago, Democrats carried Hispanics by 40 points. That margin now is down to 20 points. Increasingly, Hispanic voters are becoming more Republican as they are voting more like other working class voters. And this is a real problem for Democrats in some of the key congressional districts, particularly in the statewide elections of Senate and governor in Nevada and Arizona this year. And the third group are political independents who voted overwhelmingly for Biden in 2020. He won them by, I think, 10 points. They are increasingly feeling alienated from Democrats. Biden's job approval is in the low to mid 40s, as I said. It's in the mid 30s with political independence. So if Democrats perform that poorly with political independence, it's going to be a very long night for them election night. So I just want to talk for a moment before we get to Q&A about what's going to happen the day after the election. So if you ask people in Washington right now, what's going to happen? They're going to say, well, I think the Republicans are going to take the House, and I think they'll probably take the Senate. They've kind of, in their own mind, sort of psychologically baked in that that's what's going to happen. I think what people are vastly underestimating is how different our politics are going to be 2 weeks from now based on these midterm elections. And I think it's going to be closer to a political earthquake than what the pundits think. And I want to tell you why. You can say what you want about elected officials, but what they completely understand self-preservation. They completely understand what they need to do to survive politically. And the problem we have in American politics in general is that all the political incentives now are for Republicans to move further and further to the right, and for the Democrats to move further and further to the left. And the problem we're going to have after the election is those political incentives are going to go on steroids. And the reason why is a confluence of events. The first is the presidential campaign is going to start the day after the midterms. I think it's going to be completely overtly start on the Republican side. You've got, depending on how you want to keep score, probably at least eight Republican senators who are going to run for president. Probably have as many as a half a dozen former and current Republican governors running for president. They're going to go out of the gate, and it's going to be a race to the right. But all these Republicans see who can be more of a right winger, because that's the political incentives that are required to get the Republican nomination for president. The second is, I believe that the Democrats are going to have a primary for president. I think it may be a little more nuanced in the beginning. But if there is a Democratic primary for president, which I believe there will be, their political incentives are all going to be to move as far to the left as you want. Now, we can say that, Joe Biden was the most moderate candidate and got nominated in 2020, and Hillary Clinton was the more moderate candidate, and she prevailed in 2016. And that's accurate. But as I tell people, the left and the Democratic Party, they may not have won these elections, but they won the political debate about the positions that the candidates took in the election. If you look at President Joe Biden and his views on issues, they have nothing to do with his positions he took 35 years in the United States Senate. If you look at the policies of the Biden administration, they don't remotely resemble the policies of 8 years of the Obama administration. So the first political incentive that's going to push these parties to their extremes is going to be the presidential election. The second one is going to be divided government. So it's very likely we'll have divided government with, as a minimum, Republicans taking the House, more likely, I think, both parties. So you're going to get nothing done at the federal level because Biden will veto whatever they pass, but they will be passing all these legislations, the Republicans in the Congress, as basically political rhetorical devices about positioning for 2024. And then Biden's reaction is going to do what all presidents do in this situation, which is he's going to rely on executive orders to get done through the power of the executive branch, but he can't get done legislatively. And that walks us into the third factor creating these political incentives, which is what's going on in the states. So unlike the federal government, and this gets back again to this broader thing, what's going on in America and people self-selecting where they live and the values driving where they live, we have 37 states right now, 37 states where one party has complete political control in the state, the governors and the control of the state legislature. So we're going to have probably as many as 40 states after the election. So whereas nothing gets done at the federal level because of divided government, everything can get done in the states because one party runs and they can enact laws almost overnight in 40 of the states, maybe even more after the election. So you're going to have two different cross currents coming out of Washington, which is going to drive activity in the states. One is, I've already alluded to it, which is the Biden administration is going to put these executive orders through. And then the states, there'll probably be 26 states as many as 26 states, and the Republicans are going to have complete control. So they're going to, these Republican states are going to be largely organized and unified. They're going to fight the executive orders out of the Biden administration, both in the courts by the attorney generals in these states, challenging the ability of the federal government to make these laws, and the others politically in these states to change laws in these states, these Republican states, that run counter to the executive orders of what the Biden administration put through. The second thing that's going to happen is the Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court now is the most conservative that it's been since the early 1950s. And if you wanted to understand what is a single through line to explain the positions that this new, fully empowered right-wing court is, what is their strongest one through line that's going to drive their decisions? And it's their belief in taking powers away from the federal government and giving it back to the states. And they have a half a dozen issues on social issues that are pending that they'll probably rule on this session, that eventually the states are going to act on, particularly the Democratic states. So you've already got a taste for that from Roe versus Wade when they overturned it. So you're going to see a lot of pressure in the Democratic controlled states to try to undo at the state level what the Supreme Court did at the federal level. So that's going to create more incentives. This is a very unvirtuous cycle between the gridlock in Washington and the power of the states to act on laws. That's going to create, I think, a much more toxic environment. And so the last thing, I can touch on some of the policy implications down in a minute in the Q&A. I think that I'll leave you with where I started. I believe that we're in the middle of this long transitionary phase in our country. I can explain to you how we get out of it, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. If I spoke to you 3 weeks from now, I'll say to you, 8 out of our last 9 elections, the country voted for change. I think we're in a period of time that's going to continue well into this decade before we get to the other side and to get some sort of more positive direction in our country. So I'm anticipating this period that we've been in. The economic period started with the decline in the middle class in the early 1970s. This tribal politics started forming politically in the early 1990s. We're now a 50-50 country, and what I described, that half the country thinks we're changing too fast. The other country, half the country doesn't think we're changing fast enough. What's going on in our politics and how people vote is a reaction to what's going on. Politics are a lagging, not a leading indicator of the state of a country. So I think we're in for several more election cycles of what we're dealing with right now before we hit bottom. So on that cheery note, I'm happy to take any questions there.
Okay, so Doug, thank you for a very rich, if not entirely uplifting presentation. I want to encourage everyone who's watching to start sending in those questions. Let me ask you, start off with a few questions. One theme that has permeated a lot of the commentary about this election is that a lot of people with a lot of experience don't really trust the polls anymore. And many of them are reasoning from their own personal experience. They would never pick up the phone to talk to a pollster who is actually doing it. We know pollsters are having to make vastly more calls to actually get someone to pick up than they used to before. So I guess the first question is, how much should we believe the polls?
Well, the polling is even more difficult in an off-year election because you don't know who's going to vote. So in general, I think that you have to have some skepticism on the polls. The reason that the polls are untrustworthy are a combination of factors, starting with so Gallup does it's really quite, Gallup has done an analysis for 50 years on trust in institutions. And there are only 3 institutions in America that have a positive rating right now. That's small business, the military, and the police. So all the institutions in America, most of them are positives are in the 20s, believe it or not. And they've all gone down since COVID started. They've all gone down considerably in the last 20 years. Polling is just considered another institution in America that you shouldn't trust. It's a general matter. There's also the bias in polling because there's a trend line of people who are least likely to participate in polls, and they skew lower educated and Republican. And they also skew more than most people to distrust institutions and distrust polls. So what I've done, and it's worked pretty well, but it's certainly not scientific. I assume on election day as a Democrat that the polls underestimate the Republican strength by around 4 points. So I plus up by 4 points, whatever the polls show. In a Republican area, whatever the Democratic vote is on election day is what I assume they're going to get. So it's not a perfect way to look at the polls, but if you walk into it assuming that the polls underestimate Republican strength, and I've been, like I said, plussing up 3 or 4, they've been pretty accurate. The 2016 election, in which no one thought Trump would win, the national polls were pretty accurate. The problem wasn't the national polls, it was in the state polls and in these smaller subgroups. And that's going to be the case, I think, in the midterm. So I think if there's an expectation that Republicans are going to do well based on the polling, then I think they'll probably even do better than that. I mentioned earlier, I'll leave you with, people can talk all they want about we're going to do this and do that. At the end of a campaign, if you want to know what the parties are doing, just follow the money. And the Democrats are spending money right now in Democratic districts that overwhelmingly voted for Biden, while Republicans are spending money in the same districts, and they're taking money out of more marginal Republican-held districts. So if you follow the money, both parties right now think that the Republicans are on the offense. And as I said earlier, Republicans think if Biden won a state or a district by 12 points or less, they can win it in November.
Another question for you. Are there really still independents in this era of intense partisanship? There's a very interesting column in today's New York Times by Thomas Edsall that suggests that the wave may not be as big because everyone knows exactly which team they're on in a way that Americans haven't known in memory. And that, as you said before, it is all about turnout. I guess the question that I have is there anyone out there whose mind is really open to arguments?
Well, when I started in politics, they used to say that there was Tweedledee and Tweedledum between the parties. There was no difference. Well, they're certainly not saying that anymore. But I believe 2 things about American politics. One is American politics, I think, is largely center-right. There has been an increase in people who say they're liberal or progressive. It's in the high 20s. But the majority of America, I think, is center and center-right. I also believe that I think they're around, I'm throwing kind of broad numbers around. There's around 35 to 40% of the country that's crazy right-wing Republican, and there's 35-40% of the country that's crazy left-wing Democrat. So I think there's around 20 or 25% of the country that are what I call civilians, and they're up for grabs. I think they think that Republicans are creepy on social issues and they can't trust Democrats with their money or keeping their streets safe. And so they tend to be voting. They're the ones in the balance of power, and they're the ones who they don't as much vote. If you look at the Biden vote in 2020, and you look at the Trump vote, the overwhelming percentage of people who voted for Trump, when asked why they voted for Trump, said because they support Trump and his policies. When they asked people why people voted for Biden, by around 16 points, they said they voted for Biden as a vote against Trump, not a vote for Biden. So I think there is that 20% of the country that pretty much votes against whoever's in power because they feel they can't trust them. And they can tip an election, and they do tip elections. Unfortunately, right now, it's driving our politics. And part of Etzel's point here is it's a negative driven partisanship. People are voting a lot. Most of the Democratic vote is not so much they're voting for the Democrats and what they're for, is they're voting against Republicans and what they stand for. And the same for the Republicans. So that this is a negative drive that's motivating people to vote. But there is that core group of people that do decide close elections. And that group, by the way, voted again, more against Hillary than for Trump. But that group I described to you decided the victory in 2016 for Trump and for Biden in 2020. But it was a negative vote, and it was that swing group that did it.
So I'm sure that we are getting a lot of questions about the about your presentation. I'll get right to them. But since you said you thought there was going to be a nuanced primary for the presidency in 2024, I'll just jump ahead to make sure that that question gets answered. Everyone I talk to who's anywhere near Joe Biden said he's determined to run. How does this play out?
Well, so just on the Republican side, where I did not use the term nuanced, not only is there no fear of running against Trump, there's actually a fear that if you don't get out early, you're going to look like you're a reaction to Trump and not a cause for Trump.
Uh-huh.
The Democratic side, depending on who you are, is much more encumbered the day after the election in stepping out against Biden, particularly say someone who's in his cabinet, but there are other people as well. So the first question is the right question isn't, is he running? The really right question is, if he runs, does he have a primary? And the reason I say that is the last 4 sitting presidents who had primaries, none of them got reelected president. Johnson, who got out after the New Hampshire primary, Ford, Carter, and Bush the first. So the question is Biden going to get primaried? If he gets primaried, and by the way, talk about political incentives. If Biden runs for president and he gets primaried, you're going to see him feel even more pressure to go to the left as president in his remaining time as president. So I'm skeptical that Biden is going to avoid a primary for the following reasons. First of all, he's not doing well. He's low to mid 40s on job approval. He'll be 80 years old by the end of the year. 70% of the people in the country think we're heading the wrong direction. A recent Wall Street Journal poll, 100% prediction of a recession next year. So that combination doesn't strike me as a very fertile environment for an incumbent president to avoid a primary. And, while we say, well, we just had an election, 2024 is a long time off. It's going to be a very narrow margin for Biden to make a move before moves are going to be made on him. He has to take the position right now he's running, because anything less than that is going to open the floodgates. People like Biden. He will go down as a historic figure before, if he doesn't move, he's going to get moved on.
Okay. So just a footnote to that one. Isn't there a potential for a Democratic train wreck if there is a primary? Won't there be a strong expectation that the vice president would be the expected next choice of the Democratic Party? And if she did not, in fact, win the nomination, that it might dispirit a key constituency, African Americans?
It absolutely would. But I think that, I can't even think of what the right analogy is, but maybe it's like, in the old days, if you were at school and you had a substitute teacher that day in school. There are there are no rules.
Yeah.
We're kind of, as a country in politics, in the substitute teacher lifestyle. I don't think there are any more rules.
Okay.
And in the old days, you would step aside for the VP. I don't think that happens any, and I don't think, a bunch of people who ran in 2020 in the primaries, I don't think they came away from that feeling like they didn't have Harris's measure. I'll just say one last thing. I don't have any idea what's going to happen, but my own belief is, and I'm not saying who's going to run or not run, but I think that when you look at the general election ballot in 2024, I don't think Trump will be on it. I don't think Pence will be on it. I don't think Biden will be on it. And I don't think Harris will be on it. I think the country is ready to move on to a new generation of leadership. We have, as we all know, the oldest president in history. We have the oldest Congress in history. The average age in this Congress is 66 years old. The Democratic leadership in the House is they're in the 80s. The Republican leadership in the Senate's in the 80s, and the Democratic Senate leaderships in the Senate is in their 70s. Over half the country are millennials. The biggest voting group in America are millennials. There's no representation. If things are going well, it'd be one thing. Things are not going well, and I don't think there's a desire by a majority of Americans to keep this current generation in power in the future.
Okay. Well, will Liz Cheney be on the ballot?
I don't know that she will be on the ballot. I mean, there's a question about she won't be on the Republican Party ballot. There is there is an intellectual discussion people have, and they have the numbers about a third party, and that we can have a fusion ticket, and there are a lot of impediments to that in our system, but that is a possible. She says, particularly Trump become the Republican nominee, that there'll be a new conservative party in America. And there could be, fracturing on the Democratic side to the left as well. But I'm skeptical that, as I said, I actually am completely open to a variety of profound changes in the structure of American politics by the end of the decade, into the next decade. I just don't think it's going to happen in 2024.
Okay, I want to start addressing some of the questions from the viewers. This is one from someone you well know, but whom I am prevented by German data privacy laws from naming. And let me read to you his question. You explained very coherently why partisanship has intensified. I still wonder why that was what was very clearly an attempt by the last president to thwart the peaceful transfer of power through lies and mob violence, backed up almost uniformly by the Republican Party, does not have more salience with moderate suburbanites and others who are not committed MAGA-ites. The fundamentals of our republic seem to be under threat, yet it all seems to have been priced in and to count less than the price of gas that the government can't control anyway. So there it is, the question everyone's asking: why does the threat to democracy theme seem to count so little right now?
Well, I think America is soft and spoiled, and no one can confuse the baby boomers with the greatest generation. And I think the current generation grew up in a period of unparalleled and unmatched prosperity without paying any sacrifice. And the older people, baby boomers, they've been far enough ahead of the decline of our country because of our failure to step up to what we're responsible for, that they're going to pay the price the way that subsequent generations are. But I believe starting with the Vietnam, I'm sure this is not the answer you were expecting, but I believe that the real decline of America, in many ways, the core decline, our values and who we are, started in the Vietnam War. But it wasn't in the traditional way we talk about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War marked the first time in our country's history that we all were in it together. It was the first time that people with money and power gamed the system, didn't fight, were able to get out of the war, and started creating these divisions and began this beginning of this anger towards the elites in this country who play by a different set of rules. And then you get this whole, beginning of in the 70s with decline of manufacturing and shareholder capitalism and globalization in the 80s and on with technology, where you've created this two Americas where the people at the top who created this tremendous wealth and opportunity with no sacrifice, where everybody else was starting to pay a price. So I think we're soft, and we, the people who lead this country, the generation, we've never sacrificed. We've been entitled. People always talk about doom and gloom, and their lives are fine the next day. And it's created this alienation in this country. The last thing I'll leave you with, there was a Wall Street Journal poll at the end of August. 52% of the people in this country said they were one of the people in this country who the elites look down upon. So it's that schism and the failure of the leadership at the top and the lack of a willingness for a collective self and sacrifice that's gone on for decades now. I think what you're seeing about the threat to democracy and lack of urgency is a symptom to this disease that's been happening now for half a century.
So decadent America.
And Putin and those guys, I mean, he overestimated the mettle of NATO, but for the last 20 years, every time he put America to a test, he saw that they failed the test and that he could go further and further and not pay a price.
Let me now touch on a question that is being posed by several viewers in different ways, but the core of it is the same. There's an argument out there. It's most notably associated with I think a political scientist named Barbara Walter, that a new civil war cannot be ruled out. And I'm wondering if how you feel about that.
Well, I don't know, but I can tell you that if you look at the trend lines in decline of America and what has become normalized, for me as a Democrat, it was hard for me to wake up the day after the 2016 midterms, 2016 elections, and think that the United States of America could elect Donald Trump president. It was just unimaginable to me. I then looked at his 4 years as president. It was unimaginable to me that someone like that could be president of the United States and do what he did. We then had an election. So Biden won. It was unimaginable to me how much further as a country we could decline based on the period of time between when Biden was elected and when Biden took office, with how Trump said he didn't lose, how the Republicans didn't take him on, the January 6th. So it was unimaginable to me that would happen. Then you look at what's happened since Biden has become president, and what has become normalized is further unimaginable to me. So I guess the point I'm making is, I don't know where we're going, but I do know that if we don't hit bottom, because we'll keep going further down, if we don't hit bottom, that there's an inevitability of something like a civil war that seems to me to be increasing. So we've got to, and that's why I think the stakes are so high in 2024, because if we don't figure out a way to hit bottom, then I actually don't know where we're going to
go. That's pretty sobering. So let me ask you a follow-up question on that. Our institutions, our arrangements seem to be guaranteed to drive us farther apart. The primary system ensures that party activists who tend to be farther right or farther left dominate in the primary system, which results in candidates who may be, farther from the center. You described us as a center-right country. I think that's right. That is one aspect of the problem. The other aspect of the problem is that these trends also, as we live in more sorted out communities, hard left, hard right, lead to government that doesn't do anything. Whether it's the filibuster or any of our other requirements in voting in Congress, it's virtually impossible to get anything through. And in fact, Biden has had a remarkable a couple of years in terms of his legislative achievements, far greater than anyone would have expected. But the norm now is more like Trump. You get one bill signed in 4 years, and in his case, it was a tax reduction. Isn't anyone, at least in the Democratic Party, thinking about how to break this cycle of moving towards the extremes? And is there any possibility for bipartisanship, or are the incentives simply all lined up wrong?
Well, you really hit the key word there, which is incentives. And I'm going to come back to that. I want to talk briefly about presidential primaries, and then I want to talk about breaking the fever. So someone described to me once, presidential primaries at the end they create like a chemical reaction that is often unanticipated. And I think that's true. If you take the 2020 Democratic primary, Biden got killed in New Hampshire, got killed in Iowa. I don't think he had an event the entire campaign where 1,000 people showed up. He was left for dead in South Carolina. He won South Carolina. It looked like Bernie Sanders was going to become the nominee. You had this chemical reaction within 2 weeks in which the entire party lined up behind Biden. Completely unexpected. Never would have expected that. So I think in presidential politics, a chemical reactions based on the moment is what's going to drive what happens. I think, and I'll try to do this really quickly, I actually believe if we can survive the short term, we're going to be okay in the long term. And the reason why and what we need to do are three things. One is, at some point, the country, you can't blame the politicians. If they say what they say and they get reelected, they're going to keep saying what they say. And so only when the public punishes these elected officials will they change their behavior. And so the question at some point is, are the voters of this country going to be so fed up and hit bottom that they're going to take their anger out on their elected officials? I think they will. I don't think that's imminent. In other words, I think we're having a few more cycles of this. But at some point, the voters are going to be so fed up that they're going to punish these guys. The second thing is to change the political, is to change the incentive. They are changing the incentives right now at the state level. It is slow. So you have jungle primaries now in California and other states where everybody runs against everybody. The top two finishers go on to the next round. That makes moderates all of a sudden key voting blocks. Ranked choice voting, like in Maine and Alaska and other states are adopting, where you put in order who you want, and after the fifth place person falls out, votes go to the fourth and whatever. That incentivizes moderate voters. Breaking down the electoral college system so every congressional district gets a vote. That's going to create more incentive. So that is all happening, but that is slow. And the third and last thing is, it's when, and I've alluded to it several times already, once the baby boomers who've been clinging to power are pushed off the stage and the millennials take over. I know it's fun to laugh at millennials and they're in their parents' basement in their pajamas. The millennials, they know nothing but what they know. They know nothing but failure by government. They don't believe in any political party. They don't believe in any institution. They've seen nothing but what that's done to their families. They're taking their lives into their own hands. They're much more communitarian. The millennial left and right agree on a lot of issues like environment and other things. So I think when they're able by maybe the end of the decade to take power in this country, and the country is fed up and the political incentives change, I think we're going to get out of this, but I don't think it's imminent. I think we're going to have several more cycles of this until the country is fed up.
So one other thing that could happen in the near term is that we could find that we have a lot of secretaries of state, that is the people overseeing elections around the country, have decided that it's not their job to validate the will of the majority, but rather the will of their party. And that has been, you know, something that has been discussed a fair amount in the press. Are you worried about that? Is that a likely outcome or a strong possibility? And if so, you know, what can be done to prevent that from happening if those people win those offices?
Well, that's a really good point, which I should have raised about the midterms. And there's actually, there's even a Supreme Court threat to that, as well as the states, and I'll come to that. So I think I guess I'm less worried about the outcome of the 2022 midterms in terms of, you know, are they going to count the votes? Are people going to say they won or lost? I think the bigger danger is that a number of people are going to get elected in 2022 who are going to have an ability in 2024 to ascertain who won or lost in the state. And those stakes are quite high. And I should mention one thing. I think it's important for you all to remember as you think about 2024. I've alluded to it several times about this sort of tribal voting and people living in states based on, you know, what their values are. I've written this piece. It'll probably hopefully be published next couple of weeks. Daniel, I'll send it to you. It's basically my view that education is the new fault line in American politics, not race. And I suspect if you look at the Brexit vote and some of the other voting in Europe, you're seeing the same trends. And so I think that that's the new fault line in American politics. There are 45 states that voted for the same presidential candidate in 2016 and 2020. There are only 5 states that voted for the winning candidate both times. I believe there are 43 states right now in America politics that are not up for grabs politically. There are only 7 states that matter in determining the outcome of Senate and governor elections now, because they're the only competitive states left, and presidential elections. So the 5 states that voted the same for the winning candidate in 16 and 20 were Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There are 2 other states: Nevada, which voted for the Democrats by less than 2.5%, and North Carolina, which voted for Republicans by I think less than 1%. Those are the only competitive states currently in American politics. And the reason they're competitive is they're still going through the transition that the other 43 states went through. And the transition of those other 43 states was driven by education. And so you have 3 in the industrial Midwest, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, that are transitioning more towards what a Republican state will look like. It's taking some time. And these other states are transitioning to more of a Democratic leaning states, although it's unclear where they're going to end up. So you only have 7 states in transitions. That's really the only 7 states. If you tell me the outcome of those 7 states in the voting in this November, if you tell me the outcome of those 7 states in the 2024 presidential election, I'll tell you what happened in American politics. The reason I bring this up is in most of those states, Republicans have election deniers on the ballot. And in most of those states, Arizona, they could sweep the states. But in most of these states, they're going to be, probably if it's a red wave, electing people who are going to decide not only how the voting is conducted in 2024, but what votes are counted. So the stakes, I think, from the 2022 midterms are enormous in those 7 states. And the last thing I'll say is, I alluded to it, and remember, the Supreme Court is all about taking power away from the federal government and putting it in the state. But there's a case that the North Carolina Republicans, the legislature, put forward that is sitting at the Supreme Court right now, which if the court acts on will basically take power away from the federal process of deciding who wins the state and leaving it to each state to decide. So those twin trends, I think, pose great risk to the conduct and the execution of the 2024 elections.
Quick question. The legal problems of Donald J. Trump, do they matter at all to either the midterms or our politics now?
Well, they've mattered a lot within the Republican Party. There's an interesting question that NBC asks, and has asked for 20, or has been asking since Trump took the scene, which was, are you a Republican because you're more a supporter of Trump, or are you a Republican because you're a Republican? And the current number is around is a plus 17, that they're Republicans because they're Republicans and not Trump. If you asked that question a year and a half ago, it was around 17 the other way, where a 17% majority of plurality said they're a Republican because of Trump. So the Trump problems, I think, have the biggest impact has been within the Republican Party, and the willingness of Republicans to step forward and say they're going to run against Trump. And I just say one other thing about this. The dirty little secret about Donald Trump was, or is, that a lot of his policies were popular with the American public. And in fact, if you look at some of Biden's positions as president, while he clearly has a different tactics than Trump and all, there are a lot of areas that Biden's tactics or approaches on issues weren't as different from Trump as people expected. And so for a lot of Republicans, they like the Trump policies. They just don't want to be lugging around Trump anymore. And the investigations and all have given them license. And one thing I'll just mention on that, I think there's going to, I think Biden's policies on China have been more similar. Dan, you know more about this than I do. But I think for a lot of people, his policies have been more similar than dissimilar than Trump on China, different approaches and different ways to express it. I don't think you've seen anything that's going to happen, and the arms race that's going to start 2 weeks ago on both sides on who can be tougher on China, who's going to be more anti-China, who's going to be more aggressive on China. And that was an area, one of the areas that Trump, I think, captured the mood of the country much more so than Clinton, Bush, or Obama. And so I think that Trump's foibles and problems have really empowered Republicans to say you can have the best of both worlds. Trumpism without Trump.
Since you brought it up, foreign policy, that is, which, of course, we all know never makes it into the State of the Union or anything else. Do you think that Ukraine cuts anyway in the election? And to follow up on that, would you agree that if the Republicans take the House, as Minority Leader McCarthy has suggested, U.S. funding for Ukraine is going to be very, very difficult?
So I think the implications of Ukraine in our politics is more significant post-November than November. I think that as a direct issue, it won't have a big an impact. It's had a significant, I think, impact against the incumbent party. One is real and one psychological. I think the psychological is this general sense that the wheels are coming off in the world, and the people who are running our country, the Democrats, aren't, really doing a very good job. My life felt more normal with Trump, believe it or not. The other thing is that obviously had an impact on our economy in terms of price of oil and other issues. And so it has had an impact, but indirect, not direct. I think, again, I'm in areas that, 1,000 times more than I do. I assume that part of Putin's calculation going in was the lack of willingness of NATO to hang tough, and the fact that Americans at some point would get distracted or bored or wouldn't have the appetite to stand strong. And we do have strong xenophobic tendencies in America. And so I think that there are some telltale signs of some potential challenges going forward after the election on both the left and the right, that a blank check is no longer in order. And I think those pressures will intensify if we in fact go into recession next year. So you had, as you alluded to, McCarthy put out about a week ago, he kind of half walked it back, that you shouldn't assume that Republican House is going to keep writing these checks. He kind of walked it back a little. Then you had this idiotic letter that 30 some odd liberal Democrats put out 2 days ago, which they walked back yesterday, basically saying it's time to start negotiating peace. So what's happened, that's a sign of something bigger going on in America. So I wrote a piece around eight years ago called "Which Side of the Barricades Are You On?" And the piece basically said, the new fault line in American politics is either you're on the side of the working people or the side of the people with power and the oligarchs and the internationalists. And so you had Romney and Hillary Clinton and the banks on one side, and Trump and Bernie Sanders and people with pitchforks on the other. And the point is, the left and the right, which is really the energy of American politics right now, the left and right populists, they agree on a lot of issues. They get there for opposite reasons. So they're completely agree on getting tough on China. They're going to completely agree on going after tech companies after the election for different reasons. I think they're going to agree on, like, let's take a look at what we're doing in Ukraine and how long are we going to do this. So I think they're going to be these pressures. Again, if the tougher the economic environment in our country, the more our xenophobic, worse tendencies surface. But I think that there's an appeal from both the left and the right to land in these places that are anti-interventionist, anti-global. And I do worry about their appetite to withstand a long winter and the continued need for funding.
Well, I think you're right about Putin's calculations, although I think he thought that NATO would bug out back in March. I think you're right about the divisions in the Democratic Party. I think the divisions in the Republican Party are in some ways more interesting and more imminent, because you have a wing of the party that is more heavily represented in the Senate, led by McConnell, which, much as it might like to, take a Democratic administration off the rails, is still internationalist and still identifies as anti-Soviet or anti-Russian, as the case may be. And against that, you have, the Matt Getzes and J.D. Vances and others who but especially in the House, who are really isolationist in a way that the rest of the party isn't. And it seems like, that there's going to be a lot of tension there.
Well, Dan, I'm piling on a little more bad news here. So I'll start with the Senate, and then I want to talk about the parties. So to the extent there's been any sort of a outpost of resistance to Trump and the Republican Party that's been in the United States Senate, I think he's taken over the grassroots of the state and local party, certainly has controlled the House Republicans. Depending on how big the Republican wave is in November, I think the last outpost is falling. You have 6 members of the Republican Senate Conference who I call the governing adult wing of the Republican Party. Those people you're talking about, they're all leaving the Senate after this election, 6 of them. And they're almost all going to be replaced by Trump acolytes. So if you look at the Republican Senate, it's going to look more and more like the rest of the Republican Party after this election. And if the Republicans pick up some of these fringe, more if they pick up the New Hampshires and the Arizonas of the world that are considered right now not competitive, that's even going to be more Trumpy. So the Senate Republican Conference is going to change. But I want to just say that Republican Party is close to a coherent political party intellectually, more so than the Democrats, and I'll come back to that. The Republican Party is now a working class party. They are making huge inroads into non-white working class voters. It's clear, and the voters get it. Now, they can't win by just being a working class party. So their formula, which is probably going to work in November, is to take that working class base and scare the hell out of moderate suburban voters that Democrats are going to spend their money, they're going to take over their schools, and they're not going to keep their streets safe. And so that is their formula as a party going forward. And that's a coherent strategy. You may like it or not, but that's a coherent political party. The Democratic Party is really just a federation of people that they completely agree on who they're against, but their focus is not the same. So you've got the pro-choice wing, you've got the anti-gun wing, you have the pro-labor wing, you have the pro-environmental wing. So you have all these different constituencies. And if you want to know like how it played out, it was that sort of Turkish bazaar of Biden trying to figure out how to get these aid packages and which of the federations he was going to pay off. And so he ended up paying off all of them, which meant that he spent a ton of money. And at the end of all that, no one really knew, what they were doing except spending a lot of money. So I think the state of the parties have changed. They've changed because of that. What side of the barricades fork in the road that as I said, that started, that was caused by the changes in our economic in our country starting in the early 70s, the political changes that happened in the 90s. And then the people saw what happened with the economic crises and everything that's happened in there, the seeds of which were the Vietnam War I alluded to, which was there two sets of rules in this country, the people with money and power and the people without. And so it's the people without that is the base of a modern Republican Party.
So I'm glad you got to this, and I continue to be unable to figure out why Hispanics and even a small number of African Americans in the working class would gravitate toward a Republican Party that had made as one of its sort of defining lines or axes where it stood on race. And I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, okay, I'd be happy to. So if you look at history of immigration in America, if you look back to the immigration in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before we shut the door, if you take Irish and Italian Americans who came here as an example, every subsequent generation that assimilated into America, they identified less and less of who they were and where they came from, and more about where they were in their life, in their station of life. So the ethnic politics became less central as they assimilated. Hispanics now, so the Immigration Act of 65 lifted the country quotas for the first time since the early 1900s. So you had this explosion of new immigrants from America, from the south of the border. You now have third and fourth generations of Hispanics in America. Their aspiration, first of all, we say Hispanics, what a ridiculous term. 50% of the country are Mexican, 12% are Cuban, and 14% are Venezuelan, and 28% are Puerto, whatever they are. You can't paint with a broad brush. What Cubans and Venezuelans think is not the same as what Mexicans think. But this assimilation of an aspiration of Hispanics is where they are in their lives. And if you look, housing is the best reflection of America and where we are. As I mentioned several times, the suburbs now is the most integrated place in America where people live together. People are much more than cities or rural areas. So you have much more variety of where people live in a suburb now than any other place in America. If you walk down that suburb and you go door to door, you have an Hispanic, you have a white, you have a black person. You talk about who they are and who they think of themselves as and where they are in their lives and what's important to them. What bounds them together is where they live and what's important in their lives, making a living, safety, their kids, their schools, more than their ethnicity. So that is what's driving the change in how Hispanic voters are voting. And Hispanic voters, by the way, if you look at their concerns about the border and how things are handled, if you look by education and where they are, they're not any different than anybody else at this point based on where they are in their station of life. And that's what Democrats have failed to understand. There was a term that Democrats lived by, which was demography is destiny. All these old white people who skew non-college, who support Republicans, are going to die off. And all these younger people, these people of color, higher percentage of education, they're all voting Democratic. So when these old white people die and these young multicultural people move up and have babies, then all these states like North Carolina and Georgia and Florida and Texas, Nevada, they're all going to be blue because of the demography. Well, demography is not destiny. And Asians and Hispanics, their aspiration in lives are like other people in lives that far outstrip their ethnicity. And that's what's motivating their vote, not voting by their ethnicity, increasingly as they assimilate generationally.
Well, we could talk about that a lot more. So then the question though becomes, and maybe this is a good place to wrap up. Why is it that, let me back up and say, I understand the piece of the Republican Party that is motivated by cultural resentment and the cultural wars, and that since from the poll you mentioned earlier, where 52% of people feel that the elites are looking down on them. I understand, even if I don't necessarily like the part of the Republican Party that is indeed viewing the world through the concern of the browning of America, that is anti-immigrant and anti-demographic change. What I don't get as well are the people who think that their economic interests will be advanced by a party that honestly, first of all, hasn't delivered as much growth during its time in office. I think it's on average 1% more GDP, which is a whopping amount of money per year per Democratic administration, but also, Democratic administrations like to spend more and like to provide more benefits. So why would minority working class voters be trending the way they are?
Well, a couple of political facts, and then I'll answer your question. So there are 206 counties that voted for Obama in 08, Obama in 12, and voted for Trump in 16. Biden only won back 25 of those 206 counties. So those counties went Obama, Obama, and basically have stayed Republican ever since. So what do those counties have in common? Those counties overwhelmingly got screwed by globalization, by trade, by the decline of manufacturing, and by an elite group of people in power, regardless of party, that screwed them. So they're gone because they believe that they were screwed economically by the people that run this country. That's what drives them. So when Trump was president, I used to speak to Democratic groups. When Trump was president, they say to me, basically what you said, Dan, I don't understand how those people with no education and at the bottom of the economic totem pole, how can they vote for Trump? It's not in their self-interest. I don't understand it. Can you explain that to me? Then I would go to a Trump group and speak. And they would say to me, I don't understand, with all the growth in this country, how people are prospering. Minorities have never seen more economic growth since Trump took president than any other president. Why aren't they supporting Trump? I don't understand. Explain that to me. And the answer is the same for both groups. This is much bigger than about 3 issues. This is about who people see who they are, how they self-identify with. Those people in those counties I described to you, just to give you a sense. So Trump carried 84% of the counties in this country. 84% of the counties. 70% of the GDP growth in this country. 70% of it were in the areas that Biden carried. So you've got 2 Americas economically. But when those people who've been left behind feel like they've been screwed by the people in charge, and those are the people that fought the Vietnam War, by the way. So these are the people that lost their jobs starting in the 70s. When they feel like that they've been looked down upon and screwed by people who have never had it better, it doesn't matter what they say about Trump this and Biden that and the economy. It's not about the economics. It's about who they are at their core. And if they think someone's looking down on them, then they're not going to vote for them. And no matter what their policies are. And the last thing is, Republicans have been very effective at reinforcing a negative stereotype about Democrats as being a bunch of drunken sailors who spend their money and can't keep their streets safe. So they've been able to reinforce that to make sure there's no wandering eye.
Doug, this has been fantastic, a masterclass on American politics. And you and I have been talking about getting you to Berlin, and now I'm determined to make it happen. So I look forward to getting you your plane ticket, and also to chatting after the election, see where we all.
I'll send you some reports you're welcome to distribute. Thank you all for having me.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.